Today's video marks the beginning of a brand new series, and it's one that's quite close to my heart because I have a lot of love for this line of action figures. I'm talking of course about the Marvel Famous Covers line. This was a range of 9-inch action figures based of course on the Marvel superheroes. They were made in the 90s by ToyBiz during that golden period when ToyBiz and Marvel had that very close synchronicity, and ToyBiz were readily experimenting with all kinds of action figures, articulation, different lines, ranges, size scales. But up until this point, ToyBiz had mainly been focusing on the 5-inch scale for their Marvel line. Of course they'd expanded to include all sorts of playsets and vehicles, but this was the first time they started to experiment with scale, and it's also the first time they had a go at reproducing cloth costumes for their action figures. And they were clearly taking the nod from the Mego releases all those years before in the early 70s. Except, as you'd imagine, they were of course updated with better articulation and more accurate and better tailored costumes. This proved to be a fairly successful line and it was quite expansive. And as a child, I just thought they were the best thing ever. I really adored these figures. So over the course of a few videos, I'm going to be taking a look at every single one that I have in my collection and taking a bit of a wider overview of some of the ones that I missed as well. And in this first video, I'm going to start off by taking a look at some of the X-Men. Now, you might be wondering why the line is called Famous Covers. Well, that's because the central conceit of the line is that essentially they're reproducing figures based on very famous covers from across the years. And this approach would have the greatest impact on the packaging, because as you can see on the front of the packaging there, we have an image of a comic book cover. Now in theory, this cover should always be something that's considered iconic or very popular or very well known or best represents the character. That wouldn't always be the case though, and across the line we see some interesting choices. So let's start off by taking a look at Cyclops. And the first thing you'll probably notice of course is that they've gone with the Jim Lee design of Cyclops from the very early 90s. This makes perfect sense. It was the current costume at the time and it was also very well received and is still very much loved to this day. In fact, it's probably my favourite look for Cyclops. And appropriately enough, they've gone with X-Men 1 for the famous cover, which of course is where the costume debuted, and this is a very striking, very memorable cover, very famous, so it makes perfect sense. I also really like the design of this packaging anyway, not just having the comic book cover there, which I think is a really neat touch, but also having that original artwork there. The illustration of the character I think is really nicely painted and really encapsulates the spirit of the comic books, I think. There's also a fairly earnest attempt to make this feel like a prestigious line, so unusually these toys are produced in these boxes with gatefold covers, and there's an effort to use foil text to make it really shiny and appealing and a little bit classy. The reverse of the packaging is fairly simplistic. It is basically a black box with in this case it's the X-Men logo, but this would vary depending on the character. And there's some original artwork that's been illustrated on the back there, which looks really presentable and really kind of fun. So I really like this packaging. I think it's really presentable and I think they've done a very nice job with it. And of course it has that gatefold cover, and I'm a bit of a sucker for this design. I really like this in my action figures. I think it works really well and makes them look really presentable and feel a bit special. So on the right hand side we have a window display showing the action figure in all its glory. Meanwhile to the left we have the interior fold, and here we have a little bit of a bio about the character and those illustrations again that we saw on the front and the reverse of the packaging. The side panel uses some of these images again, and of course uses the logo of the character's name, and as you can see, they've used the same approach for all of them so that they do stack nicely together on a shelf, and they all look very presentable because they are all formatted, but each one is different. So I really like this. I think this is a really nice touch, and there is a feel of it feeling a bit more deluxe, a bit more special. So with the figure out of the box, I think the first thing you'll notice is just how nicely tailored the outfits are. There's a real sense of quality running through these figures. On the other hand, there can also be a slight gawkish, ungainly quality to some of them, at least in terms of their body molds and their facial expressions. And the Cyclops head sculpt is probably a good example of that. Obviously they've gone for an action pose. He's shouting, he's yelling as he's firing his cycloptic beam, which on the one hand is kind of cool and will lend itself to certain poses and different displays, but on the other, he is always making this expression, so it does feel like you're kind of limited with what you can do with him because it does look a little bit odd. And it lends itself quite nice to any photos you want to take and put speech bubbles in his mouth. You can have a little bit of fun with this, and it's the kind of thing that obviously Toy Fair magazine would have done back in the 90s, and there's just something about the face that's kind of funny. But that being said, I think this is a pretty decent head sculpt. I think they've done a nice job of recreating what I think of as Cyclops. And you'll notice the paint apps are really nicely applied. There's some subtle things going on around the lips and the teeth, and there's no bleed on them whatsoever. It all looks really, really tight, and it just, yeah, is very presentable. And as I said, I really love the tailoring on these costumes. So this is the base costume here is a sort of cotton lycra kind of feel to it. So it's quite stretchy, but it fits the body perfectly, and it just looks really, really nicely sewn together. And just they've also chosen a material that it reflects the light quite nicely without it being too much, and it just looks very vibrant and bright and colourful. Now, you'll probably notice he has these oversized soft rubber gloves. This is something they use on and off throughout the line. It's not particularly effective because it's so humongous. It definitely overshadows and looks really out of proportion with the rest of the figure. And whilst there's a nice texture to them, and they are pretty flexible, there's no getting away from the fact that they look disproportionately large to the rest of the figure, and it just looks ungainly and a bit strange. And they've opted to give Cyclops cotton underwear that go over his costume, which, you know, is pretty authentic to what we're supposed to see in the comics, so I think that's a good touch. But it looks a little bit incongruous next to these leather effect bands that run around the upper thighs. These look really, really good, and they're sewn into the costume. They're part of the costume. They're not an extra that's strapped around with Velcro or anything like that. It is properly tailored into the costume, which is great. And in a way, I wish they kind of done the same thing with the underwear. As it is, the difference in colour between the two shades of yellow is a little bit jarring and disconcerting. And once again, the boots, much like the gloves, suffer from the same problem really. They're just a little bit, they're too big, they're too chunky, and they look a little bit clownish. One of the things that I love about this line is the articulation. In the head, there is a swivel at the neck, meaning his head can rotate 360 degrees. But in the shoulders, there's a ball joint, which allows his arm to kick right the way up and right the way back. So there's a huge range of motion here, which is absolutely fantastic. And it also swivels right the way around, as well as a upper bicep swivel, which is fantastic. Now, he's also got a single jointed elbow, but it does bend to a full 90 degrees, which is great. And he has a pin swivel at the wrist. Now, unfortunately, because of the gloves, you can't really see this or make the most of it, but his hand underneath the glove can spin right the way around at 360 degrees, and it can hinge inwards and out as well. Now, he's got this fantastic joint in his lower abdomen here, which allows him to bend forward, swivel from side to side, and also arc and lean from side to side as well. He also has ball joints in his hips as well, meaning that legs can arc all the way out and they can kick forwards and backwards as well. And all of this articulation is hidden very nicely by the cloth material of the costume. He's also got single jointed knees, so again his knees bend to about 90 degrees, and once again in the ankles he has a pin swivel, meaning the feet can swivel right the way around and they can arc up and down. Overall, I have to say I really love this figure. I have such great affection for it. I love that it's bright and colourful. I love that they've really tried to capture accurately the costume that we see in the comics. And despite some small flaws, I think these are easily forgiven and overlooked given the overall charm of the toy. Next up we have Gambit. The famous cover they've gone with here is Volume 3, Issue 1. And again, I think this is probably a fair choice. I think it's a fairly recognisable cover. And it's fairly significant because this was the first issue of an ongoing series. There've been a previous 2 volumes, but they have both been limited series. So this was the first time the series was going on beyond 4 or 5 issues. I really like the supporting artwork as well in the corner of this box, and some of the colours they've used, and of course the playing cards there as well. All looks really, really nice and just very, very presentable. Again, on the reverse of the packaging, we have this illustrated image here, which is absolutely brilliant. A real proper action pose. It's just very, very nicely painted. And yeah, it just really definitely captures the spirit of this character. And it's just really, really exciting visual artwork. So I think they've done a really, really nice job of this. And yeah, once again, very presentable, really displayable. And of course, here's the figure in the window display, the 2 illustrated images as we've seen on the front and the reverse of the packaging, and of course that bio to go with the character as well. So all in all, really, really nice presentation. The first thing you're going to notice about the figure when he's out of the packaging, of course, is his trench coat. And they've done such a lovely job with this, and it really, really just enhances this toy. A trench coat is always a great visual, but the material they've used for this coat is a sort of soft padded leather effect, which is absolutely fantastic. And it has a really nice texture to it, but also it really just looks sumptuous to the eye. Again, I think the head sculpt is very, very nicely done. What's interesting here is I do think they have been legitimately influenced by the famous cover it's based on, because this looks to me like a perfect rendition of Steve Gross's pencils. There's that slightly elongated, slightly watery kind of look and effect to his version of Gambit, and that's what really shines through on this mould. And I've already waxed fairly lyrical about this jacket because I think they've just done such a great job of it. But one of the things I want to point out is that this is a pretty old figure. This is over 20 years old, and yet it hasn't worn away or become degraded in any way. And I played with this toy an awful lot, so this speaks to a high quality material that they've used here. I also really like that they've bothered to give him the little hooks at the top of his jacket there as well. It's just a cool little extra detail. And yeah, again, you know, when you fold it right round, there's a couple of different looks you can go with this character. If you had a belt, you could tie that round. It looked pretty cool. The collar folds down as well. And yeah, it's just a really nice visual. But I also really like the rest of the costume too. I think they've done a really neat job of this. Again, the little design going up the side of his legs there, that piping is pitch perfect as what we see in the comic books, and it just looks great. I just think they've done a fantastic job. I love the pink and sort of magenta colours because they're just really vibrant and colourful. And you'll notice here they haven't opted for those big rubber boots. Instead, they've sculpted the feet in and they've sort of sewn in the design on his shin pads or his boots. So this looks really, really good in my opinion. I think this works really, really well. And you'll also notice that on the hands, again, the gloves are off. Instead, they've opted to just paint the hands. And I think this is way more effective. And I kind of wish they'd done this across the board, really, because this looks much more in proportion. Now, the articulation scheme for Gambit is much the same. So, of course, he can spin his head right the way around, but there's also a lot more give when it comes to looking up and down. Now, I grant you it's not a huge range, but it's much better than Cyclops, so there is clearly articulation in the neck there that allows the head to bob up and down, even just a little bit, which is great. Again, he's got the ball jointed shoulders, and of course his arms can lift up and out. There's a lot more restriction here because of the thick quality of the leather coat there. As you can see, he can't bend his arm quite to 90 degrees, but we do get the benefit of the articulation in the wrist. Now we can see that pin swivel in all its glory. It can spin right the way around and hinge in and out as well, which is great. And of course he's got the same great ab articulation as well. He's got the ball jointed hips, of course, so the legs kick out, they kick forwards a really good distance, and they kick back a healthy distance too, which is great. But best of all, because he doesn't have the big clunky rubber boots, he's got the articulation of the foot that you can really take advantage of here, so you can bend this all the way back, spin it right the way around, and it looks pretty good. Next up we have Nightcrawler, and I have to say, in terms of the cover that they've chosen for this one, this is a slightly odd choice. So this is taken from an issue of X-Men Unlimited, and yeah, Nightcrawler is up front and centre on it, but it's, to be honest, it's not a cover that I recognise. It's not one that I ever had in my collection. It's not one that I ever aspired to own in particular. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a famous cover. I don't think you could show that and people would be able to say, oh, that is, yeah, an issue of X-Men Unlimited. I know the number. And I reckon there's got to be at least a dozen other X-Men covers that had featured Nightcrawler that would have been better for this. But nevertheless, that is what they chose to go with. I like the artwork on this packaging. I'm not quite as into this image, to be honest. It doesn't look quite what I expect from Nightcrawler, but that's obviously just personal opinion. That said, it's still very nicely drawn, it's very nicely painted, so I think they've done a nice job in terms of the presentation overall. But I do really love this image on the back. This is definitely much more like Nightcrawler that I expect. So I think this is a great action pose, and again, really, really nicely painted, and yeah, very presentable. And here we see the interior inlay of the interior artwork with the bio, and of course the window display of the figure as well. The presentation of this figure is very nicely done. He does actually represent something that is a little bit different in this line because he does have some uniquely moulded features that are specific to this one release. And we'll speak a little bit more about them in a moment. But first of all, in terms of the head sculpt, they've opted, just like Cyclops, to give him the open mouth, the sort of yelling face. It's not bad, but as I said before, it does kind of limit the amount of options you have for displaying him. And I think it's pretty difficult to really get away with an open mouth expression on any figure because it always lends itself to something slightly comical. Now, this might just be me, but I'm not overly keen on this head sculpt. His head just seems a little bit too elongated, a little bit too long, and it's not really what I think of as Nightcrawler. And interestingly, it doesn't really match the image that we have from the famous cover either. My other problem with it is the colouring of this. Now, there's actually, believe it or not, two different tones running throughout this sculpt. So there's a light blue and there's a darker blue. But to be honest, the hair needs to be a much darker blue, almost a black really, I would have said, with maybe a blue wash running through it to really make it look like Nightcrawler. As it is, it just looks kind of like it blends into one, and it just doesn't look quite authentic. For his tunic, they've opted to give him this very luxurious, thick, leather effect material, which is incredibly well textured and fairly robust because no matter what, it manages to hold its shape pretty well. And being as it is such a thick material, it gives it a sort of an added depth and added dimension to the toy. Plus, it's a really nice, vibrant red, which adds some much needed colour to this figure. As I mentioned earlier, one of the cool things about this release is the fact that he has so many unique parts. So both his hands are completely unique because of course he has just the 3 fingers, and likewise on his feet he's got the same sort of cloven hoof kind of foot, which is absolutely brilliant. It's a nice detail that they've managed to render very, very accurately and without any compromise. So he's still got all of his articulation, and again he's not hampered with big gloves or big boots that in any way distract or look ungainly. But the coolest thing about this figure has to be his tail, because they've given him a bendy tail. Of course, there is a wire in the tail, which means you can bend it, but you can also rotate it as well. So you can go right the way around, and of course you can bend it into all sorts of different shapes. And I just think they've done a really nice job of this. It works really, really well. And again, after all these years, it hasn't perished, it hasn't worn away. It still works perfectly as the day it came out of the box. Articulation wise, he's a lot more like the Cyclops, because this time his head does just swivel from side to side. There's no real give looking up and down, the same that we had with Gambit, which is a real shame. And of course he's got those ball jointed shoulders there, which work really, really well with this costume. There's no problems there whatsoever. Likewise, he's able to make the most out of his articulation in the elbow and of course in the pin swivel at the wrist there. And the same is true, of course, for his lower ab articulation as well, allowing him to swivel from side to side, sort of lean from side to side, and arc forwards and backwards a little bit as well, which is pretty cool. So this one joint manages to do all of it, which is brilliant. He's got the ball jointed hips, of course, so those legs kick out to the side and they kick forwards and backwards a really good distance, which is great. And as we can see, everything works here really, really well. No hindrance from the costume, and you're able to make the most of all this articulation, which is fab. So in the end, I have some mixed feelings about Nightcrawler. I think his overall presentation is very, very nice. I love his costume, and I really think his tail's excellent, and the fact that he's got these unique pieces for his hands and feet, all that is really good. The only thing that really lets him down, in my opinion, is the head sculpt, because it just doesn't look quite right, which is a shame. So there you go, there's my overview of the X-Men from the Marvel Famous Covers line. You may be wondering whether they did any other X-Men in this line. Well, yes, they did, and don't worry, I will be getting to them. In fact, in the next entry in this series, I'll be taking a look at one character that had multiple variants in the line. But as for the guys in today's video, I have to say I have great affection for these. Now, there are some oddities to them, there's certain things that let them down. That said, I have enormous love for them, and I think they're really, really nicely done. Out of the 3, I still probably think that Cyclops is my favourite. I just think he's so colourful and he's so well rendered that I have a hard time looking past that, despite having some obvious flaws. But if you're new to the collection, or you're missing any of these in the collection you already have, I think they're definitely worth picking up, and I can't imagine that you'd be disappointed if you're able to get your hands on them. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.